Okay. So, we haven't talked about curriculum-based measurements yet, but we're going to. The research tells us that if you use curriculum-based measurements to track youngsters' progress, and you graphically represent that data, that's the big caveat. If you just collect the data and write it down and put it in a folder, obviously nothing's going to happen. But if you graphically represent it, and lastly, you include the youngster in understanding their own growth and their own involvement and have an incentive attached. Now this is this big research finding out of NIH. Then this is called an effect size. You get an effect size of 0.7 to 1. And I'll give you a refresher on, it's been years since you had this stuff in your training, but what an effect size is a standard deviation unit. So think about this. So if you administered a test that has a standard deviation of 15, most tests that we use in education have a standard deviation of 15. So suppose it was a basic skills reading test, and the youngster got a score of 80 on that test. After doing this and addressing the area of basic reading skills and including all this, since the standard deviation is 15, that kid, in all likelihood, can then score a 95, because one standard deviation, or a little more or a half. So it's someplace between a 90 and a 95 would be the growth you could expect of a typically challenged kid by doing those things. Does that make sense? The reason I'm putting that there is it's a big payoff. It's what the research is telling us, that if you use these measurements and actually graph them and make decisions about instruction, you're going to get growth from these kids. The thing that's interesting is they say that if you remove the involvement part with the youngster and the fact that you get a whoopie pie when you hit 90 words per minute or whatever it is, so that young kid, that young kid just knowing that he was above 101, that was rewarding enough. But anyway, in the absence of those pieces, your effect size or growth isn't as high. Okay, here are some of the commercially available tools. At various conferences I've attended, I've scoped these out. I've also gone to different websites. And for what it's worth, the one that all the schools that I'm working with currently are using that AimsWeb as a progress monitoring and as a screening tool. All of the DIBELS measures are in AimsWeb except for initial sound fluency. So if you're doing AimsWeb, you're doing all of the DIBELS stuff too, except for... Now the nice thing about DIBELS is it's all free. If you Google DIBELS, it'll take you to the University of Oregon website, and you can download all this stuff for free. But the downside is you then don't have any way to graphically represent it, and you have to do everything else by hand.
If you're graphically representing,
yeah.
Do you do that and you say the child is involved and you give a reward? Do you do that with kindergarten, grade 1?
Yeah.
And then you show them the graph and say, we just want this to go up? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm going to show you some of the graphs. They're pretty straightforward. Okay. Every graph is going to have a black line. That's where we want to be. Every graph is going to have a red line. That's where we are. If that red line is heading towards that black line, we're happy campers. So that's what
so
kids...
So the teacher conference with every
yeah.
child after that?
Yeah, they conference. That's exactly what it is. It's an individual thing where... And again, it's not everybody. Remember I said in that class of 20, 16 of them were all set. So you only had 4 kids that you're actually doing this with, doing the progress monitoring, because they were getting some other support services. So the numbers go down dramatically as you become more intensive in your services.
If you do that with the lower group, the higher group, how do you find out the growth they made if you're not...
Well, you're still doing it 3 times a year. Okay. Do you know what I mean? So if they're still on target, so one of the things you can do is after you do your benchmark, you can in say December, in January, you could sit down individually with each member of your class and say, here's where you were, here's where you are now, you're right on target to where you need to be at the end of the year.
So I'm doing it 3 times a year with each
Everybody.
child.
That's why universal,
And then-
excellent question. Universal screening, remember those green arrows
Right.
that went down? That's everybody gets that. Then, we're in progress monitoring now. Some kids that we might be concerned about are going to get a little more, excuse me, assessments to determine if what we're doing is making a difference. And these are some of the tools that you could use to do it.